Hello, I'm Andreas, the creator of Superforms. I'm going to show you how easy it can be to make a database backend with this form library, how it simplifies the process to just a few lines of code, so you can focus on more interesting and productive things than writing validation code, error handling, status messages, and so on. So let's get started right away. So what we have here is just a freshly installed SvelteKit site, the skeleton app. And I added a checklist here so we can track the progress. What we're going to build is a so-called CRUD application. CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update, Delete. And it's the fundamental data management that you have to do to handle data in a backend. So let's just start by installing Superforms. To do this, you just install two libraries with npm or pnpm, SvelteKit Superforms and SOD. SOD is the validation library that Superforms uses to simplify the validation process. Validation can be very complex, so it's nice to have a dedicated library for that, and SOD makes a great job. But before we can validate anything, we need a route so we can actually display something in the backend. And I'm thinking something like users / and then an ID for the user, which is very common in REST APIs, for example. So let's make a route here. We can just right click and select SvelteKit create route in the routes there. As we said, users, and then we're going to use double brackets for ID, so it's optional, so we can also create a user from this URL. And we want the server page, and we want a normal page for displaying the data. So when we have this, we can get started in displaying something. Let's just start by going to users. So let's add this checklist as well. And why not the title? So if we look at the first step in the checklist here, we want to display an empty form. And this is of course because we want to do the first step of the CRUD, which is to create a new entity, which is the user. And this validation schema in SOD is a very nice way of expressing this user entity that we're going to make. We can just create it directly by importing SOD. And then we create the schema. We call it user schema. And the syntax, as I said, is very simple. We can just make an object here. And in this object we have all the properties that we expect from user. So let's say that we want this user to have a name, an email address. But for the database we should also have an ID so we can refer to the user in some way. So if we start with ID, just let it be a string, and we said it has to be at least one character. We have the name, we should also let it be a string, and we can let it be 2 characters. And finally the email address, then we can use a SOD helper for that, email. So we got our user schema, and now we want to display a form based on this schema that we have. Just to make things simple, we can just paste a very simple form in here. We have all the 3 fields here that we want from the schema. We have the ID, the name, and the email. So let's check the first one just to make some progress here. And the next step is to post this form and validate the data. So we added a form action here. And this is where we're going to post, which is pretty much automatic with SvelteKit. And if you want to see it, we can just extract the form data from it and take a look at it. So now I'm posting this form. We got the form fields here, all empty. But let's see now how we can simplify and make things much more convenient. So let's start by adding Superforms. So we have added this supervalidate function from the SvelteKit Superforms server. We should call Superforms to preload this form that we have created here with, for example, constraints, so we can get the client-side validation. And to do that, we need to call supervalidate in the load function. So we can make a variable called form. And there we can just await on supervalidate, and we just send it this user schema. And this will create the default values for the form, so it's type safe, it will create constraints and some other things. When we do this, we just return it to the client. And then on the client, if you look on this side, we should import the client version of Superforms here, which is called Superform. So it's a form on the client side and it's a validation on the server side. So if we want to create the Superform now on the client side, we just deconstruct this form, use that with the data form that we sent here. Now I have a form ready to be used on the client. And the final step is to connect this to the form action that we just created here. So instead of starting to manually extract the data from the form data, maybe call also saw the user schema manually to validate it, check for errors, try to map the errors to action data, we can make things truly simple with Superforms. So instead of this now, we can just as in the log function, we can await for super validate. But now we send in the request as well as the schema. And if we console log form now, let's see what happens. So instead of having to do things manually, here now we get all kind of useful information. We can see that the validation is false. The valid property here, which shows that the validation didn't succeed. We get all the errors mapped from SOD conveniently to each field. And we have the data here, which is valid or not, depend on valid here. Empty will be true if we didn't send anything to super validate, as we did in the load function. But in this case, we sent post data to it, so it will not be empty. And the constraints is the web browser standards for client-side validation. So we can actually spread these properties on the form fields, and we'll see that we get an immediately client-side validation. So with that, I think the second step is done. So far, quite basic stuff, right? Which is nice in a way. Superforms is made to be easy to use, so you can just post and validate data in a few lines of code. But let's keep going and see if we can make things just as simple, even when using this form data with the CRUD backend that we're making. So this user schema can be seen as a representation of a database table entry. And if using an ORM, a user should look pretty much like the data type of the schema. To make things simple in this example, we'll create an array of users and pretend that it's a user table that we can access through a real ORM. So to do that, we can just make be an array of users, and then the type of this array will be the data type of the schema, which can be extracted using SOD's infer type. So we can infer it as the type of the user schema. And let's add some test users. Now if we want to display one of these users, we can do it very easily with super validate. But to do that, first we need to bind all those fields that we have in the form to the actual form data, which is done just as we do it in Svelte. Bind value to form, which is a store, and then get autocomplete for the fields. So we just put them in like this. And no difference yet, because the form is still empty, but it's so simple to populate the form now that we connected it to Superform. So if we just want to, for example, take the first user in the user database and populate the form, we can just do this. UserDB, the first entry, send it in with the user schema. And now as we save, the form is populated. As long as this entity that we created matches the schema, only partially is fine too. Then it will be able to send it to super validate and the form will be populated. And now let's take advantage of SvelteKit's easy to use root parameters to display any user in the database. To do this, we can extract params parameter here, and then instead of accessing the user DB directly, we can look for a user based on this parameter. And now we just supply the user instead. And hopefully now, if we enter a user here, well, what do you know? Now we can access any user in the database. And with that, I think we skipped ahead a bit. We have actually both fetched the entity and displayed it in a form. So that was 2 quick and easy steps. Now let's go back to this create new entity and see if we can tackle that too. It will be very convenient to use the same schema and load function, and that is basically what we're going to do. But there is one difference here. Now when we're creating a user, we cannot have an ID because it's not set yet. To make this possible, we need to extend the user schema to make it possible to post a user with no ID when we want to create one. Fortunately, SOD makes this quite simple. Just make a new variable, we can call it CRUD schema, and then we can use user schema extend. And here we just add the variables that we want to extend. So in this case, ID, and then we can just specify user schema shape, which is the shape of the schema. And then we just use the ID again, but now we append this optional to it, which will show that we can choose if we want to send an ID or not. And now we can just replace the user schema that we had here in the load function and the form action with the CRUD schema. And as we made the root parameter ID optional, now when we just go to /users, it won't find a user in the database and we will be presented with an empty form. Though this might not be perfect, because if we enter any user ID that doesn't exist, we will still get an empty form. In this case, we want to send a 404 error. But that's no problem. We can use a quite simple check to see if we requested a user or if we just want to create a new one. If params ID exists, but still there is no user, we should throw a 404 error. And we see instantly that it works with an incorrect, a non-existing database ID. And like this. And if we do no user, we get an empty form. Finally, we can create a new entity. And to do that, we can just, for now, just entering it some test information and see what happens. According to the server post, it looks okay. But what if the data is invalid? Of course, we have to check for that before inserting anything in the database. So we can use this valid property of the object returned from supervalidate and just check. This is how easy it is to return a failed form with Superforms. Just return it as in the load function with the fail function from SvelteKit. So at this point in the code, we know that the data is valid, so we can insert it into the database. This is where you will usually call your ORM and it will generate an ID for you. Again, we're keeping things simple and we'll just generate a random ID. And then we create the user based on the form data. And finally just insert it into the database. At the end of the form action, since everything is okay here, we just return the form just as we did in the load function. And this works, but we want to give an indication to the user that we have created a new entity in the database. And to do that, we can use a helper function called message, which is part of the Superforms package. So instead of returning form, we can just return message. The form will be the first parameter, and afterwards we can just send anything we like here. So let's just put user created. And to show this message on the client, now we will start to deconstruct more properties of this object returned from Superform. So to use message, we can just deconstruct message like this, and then we can display it anywhere on the page. Most properties extracted from Superform are stores, so they will be reactive. So let's try to create a user and see what happens. Now let's do two things to reset the form, so we can create another user easily. We will extract enhance from the Superform object, and also set the reset form option to true. After applying use enhance to the form like this, everything happens on the client. And now the form will also reset to its initial empty state. Let's create the user again. But what if validation fails? For example, if we just submit an empty form, we see the errors on the server, but how to display them on the client? Well, to do that, we keep deconstructing stores from the Superform object. This time is called errors. This is a store with the same names as the schema fields, but each property will have a string array or undefined as values. This makes it quite easy to display errors for each field. So we can see right away that errors are displayed. Let's add just a little bit of style. Before we check the create entity box, it will be nice to list all users so we can ensure that the data is created. To do this, we can query the database for usernames and IDs in a real case. But for now, let's simply send the array of users to the client and display them there. So now if we click on these, they should be displayed in the form. Seems to work fine. Let's create a new user now so we can finally check this create box. We can just keep going from here and basically post the form and see what happens now. Now we created a new user. But if we look at the data we sent to the server, we see that now we have an ID, which we should use to distinguish between if we want to create or update the user. So in the form action now, we will branch just after the form is valid. If an ID exists, we want to update the user. But if not, we do as before and create the user. Updating the user will be a job for the ORM usually. In our simple case, we will find the index of the user with form date ID and throw a 404 if it doesn't exist. Now we'll just update the user at that position in the array. We need to add the ID again because according to the schema, the ID is optional, so we need to ensure that the ID exists here. And finally, we should return a message that the user has been updated. So let's see if everything works. This important customer is now a very important customer. Submit user updated. We see that the name is now very important customer. So we have posted the form, validated the data, updated the entity with this data. Before we start working on deleting users, let's display a button for creating a user when we are at an existing one. To do this easily, we'll use the form ID property. So we can test if an ID exists. If so, display the button. So we can make an if statement and test if the form isn't empty. Then display the button. And it will just link back to the users page with no ID. For this we will also use a form, since the default action of a form is get, and that's what we want to do with the button. And the button is also what we will use to delete the user. Since a button can have a value that will only be posted when that specific button is clicked, we can use that to determine whether a user should be deleted. Again, we'll use form ID to check if it should be displayed. Let's also style this button. On the server, we now need to do a little change, since the delete field shouldn't be a part of the schema. So we'll start by getting the raw form data from the request and pass that to supervalidate to validate the form. Then in the form action, we check in the form data if the delete field exists. If it does, call the ORM, or in our case, splice the array based on the posted ID to delete the user. Finding the index is shared between delete and update. So now we can just splice the user DB array. After deleting the user, this user ID URL won't exist anymore, so we can't return a message. So we need to redirect to the users page. We do that by throwing a redirect. Should we try to delete the user? There, the important customer is now gone. Maybe that was a bit abrupt, so of course we can put in a confirmation dialog. But I will leave that as an exercise. One thing I do want to show though, since we have barely scratched the surface of what's possible with Superforms, are timers for easily displaying loading spinners. You can read more in detail on the website, but there is a timer called delayed, which we can use to test whether the form has been loading, and then it will be true after a certain time, so it will be a perfect way to display a loading spinner. So I will just import an SVG, and if the delayed timer is true, we'll display it next to the submit button. We also need to add a delay on the server to see it, because it takes 500 milliseconds before the timer is set to true. We'll do that with a simple promise await. Hopefully it will work. Not bad for one line of code, eh? Well, time is running out. There are so many other features we haven't touched on here. Client-side validation, nested form data, multiple forms on the same page, single-page applications. But I hope this gave you a decent introduction to Superforms at least. So check out the website for more information, and I'm available on Discord if you need help or have any questions. Thank you for watching.